Contributions of the students, because the art depends on the students. They're just as much part of the organization as their instructor.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome. You are listening to Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio, episode 654. My guest today is Grandmaster Brendan Wilson. I'm Jeremy Lesniak. I'm your host here for the show, founder of Whistlekick, passionate traditional martial artist. And that's why we do all of the things that we do. Now, if you're new, you might say, well, Jeremy, what are all the things that you do? Well, to answer that question, you should go to whistlekick.com. It's our online home. You're going to find everything we've got going on there, or links to the things, because it's a long list. Now, one of the things that we've got over there is our store. It's one of the main ways, really the main way that we monetize all the stuff that we've got happen, because, well, it costs money. So if there's something in there that you want to pick up, support the show and our efforts to support you, the traditional martial artist, use the code podcast15. It's going to get you 15% off, and it helps us tie together the dots that, hey, this show led to that sale. The show has a separate website. It's whistlekickmartialartsradio.com, because we name things really simply. We bring you 2 shows each and every week. The entire purpose behind everything we do, well, it's to connect and educate and entertain the traditional martial artists of the world. If you want to show your appreciation for what we do, there are lots of ways you can do that. Like I already said, you could buy something, but you could also leave a review or share an episode or tell a friend or grab a book or consider a training program or support us on Patreon, patreon.com/whistlekick. It's a place where we post exclusive content. And if you contribute as little as $2 a month, you get some of it. And honestly, we even give you free stuff, free merch at all levels, because, well, we want you to stick around. We want you to be proud of being a martial artist. It's part of why we do that. My guest today is undoubtedly proud of his martial arts career, and he's done just about all the different things that you could do as a martial artist. And he did a lot of it while serving in the military. And the combination of those two things led to some interesting stuff. We talk about some of it. We talk about his endeavors after his time in service. And we just had a really good conversation. I learned a lot. I enjoyed myself. And I'm sure you will too. So here we go. Grandmaster Wilson, welcome to Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. First of all, it's an honor to have been invited. I greatly appreciate the offer that you've made. I think we talked a little bit before the show about how honored I was to have been included with some of the very, very prominent people that have come before me. So I'm ready.
Yeah. And audience, when we were talking pre-show, he says that. And I said, how do you think I feel? I get to talk to all these people. I can call it work. I have a crazy job. It's a crazy job. I couldn't be happier or more grateful that all these people tune in and listen, and that these other people are willing to come on and share their stories like yourself. So Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Now, wherever you are, whatever you do, if you are doing martial arts or have done martial arts, you're part of a group. And depending on who you talk to, the group is somewhere between a lot of people and most people. It's certainly not everyone, but it's more than a few. And we all have a lot of things in common. But what I love about this show and the way that we do things is we get enough of the stuff that we have in common to know how to relate to each other. But there's enough that's different in how we take that common ground and run with it that it's interesting. And it's why we can do this week after week after week. So let's start with the common, and we'll let it spin out to the less common.
Sure.
When did you get started in martial arts?
I got started in 1974. I lived in Alexandria, Virginia. I was a high school student, and I got cut from the varsity baseball team. And I went down that day directly from the field to Roberts Karate in Alexandria, Virginia, where they were actually teaching Taekwondo. And I started there. And I think that was a good choice for me. And it started a lifelong love of the martial arts, for which I look back with a great deal of gratitude, both for what the martial arts have done and for the people that I've worked with, the instructors and peers and students over the year.
you were cut from the varsity team and went
Mhm.
right to start martial arts. Like, so you couldn't have just been wondering about this and all of a sudden, I guess I'll go do something else. What am I going to do? I'm going to go do this. And where's a spot? Like you were
Yeah.
thinking about it ahead of time.
Well, you got to go back to 1974. Bruce Lee, I think, had just died, but Enter the Dragon was big on. They were still playing it.
Sure.
People were interested in it. It was something that young men, or I think maybe perhaps young women, also at the same time looked to as something that would be exciting. It would teach you self defense. It would make you stronger. So of course, I had seen it, and I had seen that the sign up there. When I realized I wasn't going to be a baseball player, I decided I'd try my hand at something else.
Okay. And how did that go?
It was good. I did that for a while. When I graduated from high school, I went to university, and in the university town, there was a small Taekwondo studio. I trained there for 3 or 4 years. In 1980, I got my first degree black belt, and then subsequently went into the Army after that, where I continued my martial arts training.
Why'd you want to go in the Army?
There's a good question. Well, my father was a soldier, a career military officer, and so I had been exposed to military life, and it's a good life. I did ROTC when I was in college, mostly because one of my friends wanted to do it. I mean, it was just one of those things you do, and you get sort of involved in it. But I loved the Army. I was a total of 25 years from the day I first took the oath until I retired. So I had a lot of fun with it, and I did get a chance to do the martial arts in the military. I trained in Korea for a year. While I was in the military, I coached several martial arts competition teams. I trained close protection forces in weapons disarming techniques. And the military is a good place to meet other people who are interested in the martial arts. I met some great people through the years.
All right. Cool. One of the comments, and sometimes it's a compliment, sometimes it's not, that people will make of traditional martial arts is they'll point out the regimented, or at least to them, regimented nature of traditional martial arts training methods. And they'll call them militaristic. But yet, not a whole lot of us have the context for saying what is and what is not militaristic, especially when you're talking about really traditional martial arts. If you're talking about the traditions of Taekwondo, you're talking about what's going on in Korea. You've trained Taekwondo all over the world, including in Korea, and you've been in the military. What do you think about that comparison?
It's a good question. And one of the things you'd said was we all come from a different place, but I think it's probably fairly common for people who have trained, for several decades to have changed their position on how they view what's valuable, what's important. For example, I think a lot of people start in the martial arts looking for self-defense, looking as a young man, I wanted to have physical prowess. And then that, after a while, is not so important to you. I think you sort of develop an interest in self-perfection, perhaps a spiritual aspect to it. When you get to be my age, I'm 63, you are starting to think about health and fitness. And of course, as an instructor, you're looking at trying to pass that on. But your question had to do with the militaristic aspect. And so I do have to sort of talk a little bit about the art that I had established about 12 years ago called Aristotles. And I'll give you a little bit of the background and a little bit of my reaction to that very strict, regimented system, if that's okay.
Please do.
So in 2009, I went to Las Vegas for the U.S. Open, where I competed. But as part of that, I went through a 2-day seminar that was taught by the Kukiwon. They had come down from Korea. And then there was a test. And during that test, I had tested for my 5th degree black belt. And some of the things I actually felt like I didn't respond well to. And one of them was that the Confucian idea of courtesy seemed to be sort of a one-way thing. And I don't mean to criticize the Kukiwon. I'm still a member of the Kukiwon, so I don't want to make any enemies, but my impression was that it was very authoritarian. The people that were senior to you, and they didn't necessarily treat the people below them with the regard and respect that I thought was appropriate. I also didn't like some of the techniques, which I thought weren't really realistic. So I took a year-long sabbatical from teaching and went back and tried to research and sort of find my roots, and developed this new martial art called Aristos. Aristos basically has all the stand-up techniques that Taekwondo and Tang Soo Do have, but it was based, instead of on the Confucian ideas of discipline, it was based on classical Greek philosophy, and it replaced courtesy with the word xenia. And xenia is the Greek word for the guest-host relationship. It means that the appropriate exchange of courtesy and obligation between a host and a guest is what we use in our studios when we train. So the student comes in, the student is respected. They are treated as a respected member of the art, and they owe respect and deference to their superiors. But it's not one where we would ever dismiss the efforts or the abilities or the contributions of the students, because the art depends on the students. They're just as much a part of the organization as their instructor. And that was one of the 5 principles of Aristos, which we've used. And we've since built that up. Over time, I had 2 schools while I was in Belgium. We trained mostly expat students that were in Belgium and then went back to their home countries. And to me, back to your original question, I do think that things can be too regimented, although the military is not necessarily all just one-way authoritarian type of thing, but things can be too regimented, especially when it comes down to the respect that's due to the student.
Not the answer I expected, but
okay,
makes complete sense.
I'm just hoping I don't get in trouble with the cookie bots.
Well, the martial arts is probably the only industry. It's the only one I know of where saying something is older and unchanged is perceived as being better. And certainly not by all participants of the martial arts.
Yeah.
But there's a large contingent. Well, this is how we did it back in and there's this.
I know. Yeah.
You're older than I am, so you get it. I mean, you lived through some of that. And I know people today who think martial arts training should be at such a brutal and intense level that most people can't stomach it.
Yeah. I would disagree with that view. And although I respect other people's views to hold that, I think personally that the martial arts needs to be tailored both to the aptitude and the ability of the students within a certain framework, so the student can take out of it what's beneficial to their life. When you talk about the tradition versus the modern, I mean, there's so many different truths there. If you look at mixed martial arts training, they're very, very good, and not all of that is traditional. And I don't think anybody would ever deny that they're exceptionally capable at martial arts activities. And some of the older techniques are probably not so realistic. So that, for example, stances. I think stances should be fairly natural. If you watch a baseball player, football player, basketball player, boxer, wrestler, they do not take extreme stances. Their feet are basically shoulder width apart. And they use that as a combination for balance and speed and mobility and the generation of power. And they do what's required, and they're not fixed into it. Must be 1.5 shoulder widths with toes pointing straight forward. So I would be all for some adaptation, both for the capacity, the aptitude of the student, and for what you're trying to accomplish. So, for example, I have a 63-year-old student. I don't ask her to do things which I know would injure her, although I think she can fully develop in the martial arts by modifying some of those techniques, which are not really appropriate for an older person, and they're not necessary for an older person. We have younger people do certain jumping techniques because they can, and because it doesn't, and it's not dangerous to them. So I do think it could be adapted.
I've always explained it as everybody's reason, their why for training is different. And
Yes,
thus it's okay. If you get someone who comes into class and their goal for being there is wanting to develop a strong self-defense capability,
yeah,
you're going to push them a little differently than if you know their reason for being there is to be around other people because their home life is terrible
sure.
and they
Yeah.
need to be propped up and given some positive energy.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Jeremy, on that. And I think one of the things you'll see is that students will develop their own view over time. The student that comes in and says, I really want self defense, they'll get to a certain level and they may be comfortable with that and they may want more from the martial arts as they go forward. They also may get a dash of realism as they go against other martial artists who are very, very good. And some of these, they'll realize the limitations of the self defense techniques that they're learning. Um, you're not going to be able to beat everybody. That's for sure.
Sure. Now, I would guess that the majority of martial artists who train for at least a few years have at least thoughts, fantasies of opening a school, and some of them do. And you could make the argument that the majority of people who open a school, they're teaching something that's at least a little bit different than what was taught to them.
Mhm.
But few of them will go through the effort of codifying and naming that. So, what was the journey for you in in that regard?
Um, as I said, when I did my sabbatical, we went back sort of to the roots. Now, I started in 1974 in an ITF style, so we did the Cheng Han forms, which were fairly traditional back in the day. You don't see much of that anymore. I've also trained a little bit in Taekwondo, which is of course very similar to that. It's the precursor art to the ITF, and but I'd always been interested in Greek philosophy, and I really wanted something that would, as I said before, that would be more appropriate for the environment that we're in. So, for example, if you ask me now at my current journey in the martial arts, um, the purpose of martial arts is to show you how you can perfect yourself, not necessarily self defense or combat. So we have a term called arete, Arete, which is the classical Greek term for excellence. Aristotle had this idea that if you are what you practice over and over again. So if you practice to play the flute, you're not just someone who plays the flute, you are a musician, and you are a musician now once you've accomplished that level of mastery all the time. When you're not playing, when you're asleep, and if as long as you keep your proficiency, you will always be a musician. You have changed yourself by your force of will and effort into something that is better and different than what you were. And what we had done in Aristos was we brought in mostly college age students from all over the world, 10 different countries in my case, and just showed them that if you train in this, you can make your body do things that they couldn't do before, and to make them understand that they could make themselves different. They can go back to school, they can learn a profession, they can be a better person if that's their goal, because they have control over their destiny and their future because of their own effort.
Mm. That's something that I think most people, if you press them, if you ask the right questions, they would be able to articulate. But I don't think too many people could describe it as succinctly as you just did.
Thank you.
Was there someone along the way, either a senior officer or a martial arts instructor, who kind of laid the groundwork for that perspective?
I don't think there was any given one single person who was a martial arts instructor. I did have some very, very good martial arts instructors, and I noticed that the ones that I most appreciated were the ones who were first. They were modest, they were humble but confident in their ability. They had integrity. A lot of times when you're dealing with students, you are dealing with people who look up to you, who have a financial relationship with you as an instructor. And how do you behave towards them when it comes time for tests or for certifications, for how much you charge them, and how whether you respect them or not. So I think that gave me an impetus towards this idea that we could articulate something different. Or I think you said it right, which is most people do this. We tried to bring that out. And so I did rely a little more than a little bit, on some excellent examples that I had over the years.
Mm. Awesome. What else can you tell us about Aristos? Because I was a philosophy major in college, and so
there we go.
The idea
Okay.
of going Greek and pulling some Greek names in there, like this is it's got a different part of my brain turning. The wheels are
Sure.
spinning differently than they usually do when we record for this show. So I'm, just selfishly, tell us more.
Okay, so I went over two of them. With Zinnia is the guest-host relationship. It has to do with the way courtesy is exchanged within the training hall. Arate is the idea of excellence. You basically have the power to change yourself. As far as the technical aspect of it, we have two terms. One is arche, which is the Greek word for foundation. It's where we get the word archaeology in English. And that is a series of techniques and procedures which we consider core to the art. And you would recognize all of them, the various different stances, mostly hand techniques and blocks, not that much in the way of kicks. And then techne, which is technique or art, is the mechanism for generating power, which again, most people would recognize. You have a relaxed movement until the point of impact, where you have your maximum power, and then you relax and you prepare for the next movement. And then the final one is agon, where we get the English word agony. It's the Greek word for struggle, and it really means there's a time to just push on. When you are exhausted or frustrated or at your blue belt and nothing seems to be going right for you, you're not advancing as quickly as you had been the previous few years, there's a time to sort of persist and continue on. You could think of it during your sparring, but it's really more than just sparring. It's pushing on. And those 5 principles are the core of the idea behind Aristos. And we've had I have to say, some good feedback from that, from students and from parents, how people are adapting to that, how they're preparing to do the other things in their life which are more important, because they're not going to spend their life probably as a martial arts competitor or instructor. They're going to go off and do other things. And and whatever preparation we can give them through Aristos to do that, that's a success.
If you were to make a pie chart of where these martial arts influences came from that you codified into Aristos, what would the breakdown be? I'm assuming much, maybe even the majority of it is rooted in Taekwondo.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, it's a stand-up hard style Korean martial arts. And that's where most of my experience is. If you go back and, in my opinion, take a look at the Tangsudo, which is a precursor to what became the ITF techniques. They're very similar with some differences. So I would have to say Taekwondo is a modern one. But I started under the ITF system. I did a conversion in mid-90s where I did train with a WTF, and I have trained and competed in WTF types of organizations, but my heart and soul is really in the older techniques. So I never really got into and I don't mean to take anything away from it. I went to the 2009 U.S. Open in Las Vegas and competed in forms, and I was fortunate enough to take the silver medal in my category. But I was watching the young people spar, and they were so good and so fast. It just take your breath away. I mean, you'd see first round eliminations where the person that lost is doing a spinning hook kick faster than I could throw a jab ever, not just when I was 50 years old. So I'm not trying to criticize the techniques or the ability of people to do that, but my heart is really in an older form of martial arts. Perhaps that's just a physical limitation. So I picked the one I wanted.
Sure. Hey, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because again, your why is going to dictate what and how you do.
Sure.
And I think that not only is that okay, I think that's the intention.
Yeah.
Okay. We haven't talked much about your time in the military. I would imagine that if we were to find some theoretical way to start cutting your psyche apart, we could find places where your martial arts influenced your military service, but also the inverse, that your military service informed your martial arts training. Have you thought about that? And if so, can you speak to that?
Yeah, in fact, not a few years ago, maybe 25 years ago, I'd written a series of articles for martial arts masters about connecting the principles of war to the martial arts. In my view, the core of the martial arts comes from combat techniques, not necessarily, it's adapted for self-defense. But if you just take a look at the history, for example, of General Choi during the Korean War, they were training their soldiers during a time of combat to prepare for physical combat. The Korean ROC Marines in Vietnam used Taekwondo in combat, not in self-defense. And it's a devastating art. And although I'm not advocating that in any way, that people use those techniques to hurt other people, I do think that is the core of where those techniques come from. I was, as a very young officer, a second lieutenant, I attended the U.S. Army Ranger School, where they do have a combatives session. Portion of the instruction is combatives, and it's designed to kill your opponent. It's not designed to subdue him or get away. And it's all very, very basic. Just a few things that you do right away, right now, to save your life and to destroy your opponent. So it did have an effect on me. When I was later on, I was stationed at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Power Europe in Belgium. At the time, I was the public affairs officer for the NATO commander. And when I would travel, I would go with his bodyguards, his close protection team, because they are the people that make sure that his travel is completely safe. And they told me that they had been going to Germany to get training in unarmed weapons disarming techniques. So, I mean, their problem at the time was that they're Americans, they're in Europe, they don't have the same authorities as law enforcement would have in the United States. And if they have to draw their weapons in Europe, there are legal ramifications even where that would be justified. And what they wanted to be able to do is make sure that if a weapon is drawn in the presence of the NATO commander, that they could, if necessary, disarm the person without having to draw and discharge the weapon. So I said, listen, you don't need to go to Germany. I can do that for you. And we did do a seminar in that, and then I picked up some of them to be my students. And again, this is not really self-defense. This weapons disarming is not self-defense. It's an aggressive, offensive thing that you have to, disable the person right now and take the weapon from them right now and make sure, because you're fighting for your life, that weapon is taken away. So I think there has been some trade-off between my idea of what martial arts are and the military, and I think it goes back and forth.
One of the things that tends to happen in some segments of the martial arts community is this obsession with combat scenarios that would statistically never occur. We're not talking about I'm in a bar, I bumped somebody, they were drunk and they lashed out, or hey, I'm presented with a knife and someone's requesting my wallet. But rather, what do you do when the person pulls a gun and? Yeah. And we've got movies that I think have kind of led to a lot of this, or rather furthered these conversations.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? How do you feel when you see those conversations?
I have for many years taught women's self-defense, so I can tell you what the approach we took on that was. First of all, what we wanted to do is to put it in a realistic environment. If a woman is in the situation where she needs to use self-defense, probably to prevent a sexual assault, and we didn't want her to think that the two techniques that we taught them were going to save them. We wanted them to say your objective is to prevent serious injury, death, a sexual assault. And your best bet, of course, is to avoid situations that put you in that danger And if that's not possible, then it's to escape and call for assistance. So I think we tried to make that much more realistic. And one of the things I would do to show that realism is we would show them the standard how to break a wrist grab and how to get out of a headlock or something like that. But then I would bring I had a very strong young man who was one of my third degree black belts. And I would come over and I'd say, okay, now he's going to grab your wrist and I want you to do the technique that I just showed you. And they couldn't move. Nobody could move. He was just that strong. Yeah. So I didn't want them to have the wrong idea about what they could do. But some things they certainly can do. And if they need to respond in a self-defense situation, they need to do one or two very simple things with great force and speed as an attempt to try to break a hold and to get away. But even when we showed them weapons disarming techniques and so forth, we'd always say, when the gun's in your hand, you haven't solved your problem. Because you don't know, unless you are used to firearms, whether that gun is loaded, you don't know if the safety's on, you don't know anything. And yet the person you just took it from and knocked down isn't going to stay down. And he or she knows whether that weapon will fire or not. Your best bet is to run and not get caught with that weapon because it might be used against you. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
It does. It does. Oh, so many places we could go, and my brain's fighting for which one. So let's talk about competition a little bit, because you brought it up, you said you did it.
Yep.
But it almost seems contradictory is too strong. The way you've spoken about martial arts, I would not have put money on the fact that you would compete, especially at a higher level competition.
Yeah.
Am I misreading you?
No, I think you're right.
Okay.
Well, so first of all, people are complicated. Welcome
of course,
to the world.
Yeah. Hey, if they weren't, this show would be really boring, and we would have tapped out at like 50 episodes.
I think almost everyone, at least my age, who started back in the 70s, went through a phase where we did lots of competition because it was a lot of fun back then. And you wanted to show your ability against people from other styles and so forth. And so I had gone through a phase like that early on. Then when I was in the military, that was what everyone was interested in. The soldiers wanted to compete. And quite honestly, the commanders wanted us to compete because they wanted to say the U.S. Army team did X, Y, and Z. So we did some of that. And the U.S. Open one, I'm not really quite sure why I did that. I had just gone through it. It was an interesting story. I was a diplomat at the time. I was working overseas, and I was actually sick. I had this horrible cold, but I was in Ukraine, and then I had to get from Ukraine all the way to Las Vegas. I had to actually stop along the way and see a doctor to get my things clear. So I was actually pretty miserable when I went in there. My son, who was a red belt at the time, came out and joined me from college. So it was kind of nice to have father-son routine to go out and compete. And I just kind of wanted to go out there and try my hand against what else was out there. But you're right. I think too much competition is a caustic effect. I don't like it. I didn't do much of it when I was running my schools. We went to one fairly large tournament from Belgium. We went to Germany. And quite honestly, I didn't like the behavior of the other instructors and coaches. They're yelling at their students, arguing with the referees. There was some favoritism shown during judging. That's all completely antithetical to what I think the martial arts is about. So you're right. There is a conflict there. I guess I a little bit soured on the competition.
Okay. Do you think that competition today is dramatically different, or has just your perspective changed?
It's a good question. And I have to say that I don't follow it very much. So I don't know how much it's changed to see how different it is. I did watch the Olympics, and some of it was new to me. I hadn't seen it before. Obviously, the competitors are very, very good. But, I guess the best thing for me to say is that I don't really have enough information to answer the question.
And that's okay. That's okay. No worries. You've talked a little bit about having some remarkable people that you've trained with, but you haven't really named them. Now, of course, the names may not really be the important part, but I'd love to hear more because you've had opportunities to train in places that, let's face it, most of us are never going to train at the Kukiwan or with the Kukiwan folks. Most of us are not going to train overseas just by the numbers. Could you talk about that? Talk about the diversity of training you've had and maybe how you think that may have set you up differently than the typical martial arts journey, which is a small handful of instructors from generally the same geographical location.
Sure. So I can give you, some examples. When I trained in college at university, I went to James Madison University, which is in Harrisonburg, Virginia. There was a small studio there called Kong's Studio of Taekwondo, and the instructor was another college student, a few years older, Stan Alexander. He was a first-degree black belt, a wonderful person, very, very good at his martial arts, very dedicated to teaching the students, and I think that set me on a good path. It's always good to have a good instructor that brings you up to the level of first Dan, I think, because you're sort of set on the path with that. Years later, after I came back from Korea, I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I worked out at Boulder Karate under instructor Larry Wilk. Again, a wonderful guy, huge heart, loved the martial arts. He's since not doing Taekwondo anymore. He does other things. But I have always remembered it. We used to train at different levels. A little bit of an anecdote there. Once a week, we would do what he didn't have a name for it, but I would call it anything goes, right? So as long as we didn't hurt each other, right, we could use a variety of techniques, and it was probably closer to mixed martial arts, although that really wasn't a thing back in the early 1990s, at least not with me. But we were wrestling around, and of course, he was much, much better than I was. But we got to one point where we had sort of rolled over to where there was a little fence between, like a railing between the floor and where people could sit and watch. And this young mother had come in with like a 5-year-old child or something, and he had a large group of students. And so Larry was on his back, and he had his legs around my rib cage, and he was squishing me. And I had taken my elbows and I jammed them down into his groin area. And of course, I wasn't hurting him, and he wasn't hurting me. But it really looked like we were, fighting to the death. And I was ki-eyeing every time I hit him. And that woman just ran right out the door with her child. And afterwards, I told Larry, I said, "I think I lost you a customer." And he said, "Well, that's the way it happens." But he was just such a wonderful guy, and I'm still in touch with him. I think he's retired now. When I was in Louisiana, and I was the coach for my team from the 18th Airborne Corps, I also worked out at the local Korean master's studio, Jackie Kwan. He's from DeRidder, Louisiana. And, he's a traditional Korean instructor. He was on the Korean demonstration team back in the 50s. He was a martial arts master for both Taekwondo in the ITF and the Kukiwan and in the grappling arts. Oh, wow. And he was a wonderful guy. I mean, he was just great for the community. Lots of, I think, families where the students came from underprivileged families, and he provided them discipline and hope and support. Anytime they would get a good grade, he would give them a certificate. He'd have the local newspaper come in and take a picture of them. He ran wonderful, wonderful tournaments. Just a great guy, and he's still doing it. I still stay in touch with him. I just have the greatest respect for him, and I did my 3rd and 4th degree black belt test with him. There's some great people. And then recently, as an organizational thing, I've come under George Petroda, Grandmaster Petroda, who is the head of the International Sung Judo Association. And that's been great because he is, he is good with the Kukiwan. So if I have a student that wants to get a Kukiwan certification, we can go through him. He's a good person to call on for advice. He's honest and forthright. And if he says he's going to do it, he's going to do it. If he's not going to do it, he's not going to do it. And that's been good for me because it allows me to be an independent instructor, to do the martial arts that I want. And yet, if I need to reach out to the more formal organizations, then I have someone who can do that with integrity.
Nice. Now, what are
There's others, because I've left out some other instructors, I'm sure, but I didn't want anybody to be left off.
As long as you've been training, I can't imagine that we could ever get the whole list. Yeah. Just when we start talking about influence, because influence isn't just instructors in schools. Influence is, that person who you just click with and you're always, trying to partner up with each other because you're going to get a great workout and that you're going to advance more going with them than you will with, these other options.
I completely agree. And one of the things you'd asked about was, the other people, when I've had some great students who are an inspiration to me and have gone on to do great things. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I taught a class in Belgium for Hungarian military wives. It just so happened that was the forum. And they were, middle-aged, most of them. Most of them were the wives of military officers. And they came in, and normally what would happen is I would give them the safety briefing, and then I would say, we're going to learn some techniques, and I want you to punch the pad or kick the pad or something. And we're going to do it all together, right? Just to sort of get it going. And normally when I would do this, I would say, ready, one, right? And I would hear pop, 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 what are we doing? And they all hit at the same time. I've never seen anything like it. They were just really tough. And the whole class was like that. And at the end, I always gave them a chance to come up and break a board or something with the techniques that they had been using. And they all wanted to do it. And some wanted to do 2 boards, and they wanted to do different techniques. And I ended up getting some of those students into my class for a few years. And it was really something. I mean, these Hungarians, I'm not going to say that it's cultural or anything, but these people were very, very dedicated. They were good students. They were tough. Even the children were tough. The parents were tough. I one time had one of my students injured and was rolling around on the floor, and I called his mother to come over to the studio and pick him up. And she took a look at him. She said, "I don't see any bone. Get your ass up and go back into class." Which he did.
How old was the kid? How old was the kid?
Pardon?
How old was the child?
He was about 12. Yeah. And he ended up getting a junior black belt from me a few years later. And was a great student. In fact, if you go to my website, I don't want to put my website. If you go to Aristos.club, you'll see a picture of him doing techniques where the person doing the photographer put a timer on. And he's pretty darn fast. I mean, his hand techniques are in 1/10 of a second, and even his turning back kick is 1/2 a second. The kid was really fast. So whatever his mother made him do turned him into a pretty competent 14-year-old junior black belt.
Cool. I love it. Now, one of the other things I have here in my notes is that you wrote a book, and unlike just about every other martial arts book we've talked about on this show, it's fiction. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you got it right. So it's, I guess it's under the heading of sci-fi, but it has a martial arts theme. The main character in the book is a young Asian female naval lieutenant. She's aboard a starship. She has come from a martial arts family. Her father is a martial arts instructor. She competed in the Naval Academy, and her senior year was the captain of the competition team. So she still trains in the martial arts. And during the storyline, the actual plot line is that she's in this convoy of vessels that gets attacked as part of a galaxy-wide attack on the 500th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And she is forced to sort of step up and take a leadership role to try to put this organization back together so that it can continue to fight. And in the process of that, she starts to train with the Fleet Marine Commandos. And she trains them in the martial arts, and they train her in their techniques. And then she has to go on various different combat operations where she uses her martial arts in the process of that, she sort of discovers what her martial art is all about. So both in the spiritual sense, in the combat sense, and also in her techniques. Her techniques change because she realizes what they need to be in order to fight in combat. And as a process of that, I put in some of my philosophy in the martial arts, in what the forms are for, what the techniques are for. So it's I guess every author does that. They sort of express themselves through their art.
Sure. The decision to make the protagonist female, it's always interesting to me when you know the author of a book. I last year wrote a novel that, it's certainly not sci-fi fantasy, but has strong martial arts influences. And I can't imagine anybody that knows me reading that book and not seeing me in the main character, actually the main characters.
Uh-huh.
Was there a specific reason you went and created a female lead for this?
Well, that's a very good question. In general, I really enjoyed training young people and young women especially, partly because in the environment that they were coming from, a lot of them had not been they had not done sports. They'd been taught to be fairly submissive, not to be aggressive, not to be loud, not to assert themselves. And then, of course, we treat everybody the same in class. And typically, there was a time when I was doing this for one of the local church organizations, and the parents would drop their kids off and then pick them up, and they didn't really know what the children were learning. And then we would have a test, and the parents would come, and we'd have the pastor come, and some other notables would come, and then you could just watch their faces as their daughter, smashes 3 boards. And then, we do the self-defense. And you and I both know that self-defense during a test is a little bit programmatic. I mean, they know exactly what's coming. But, they see a big male near adult swing at them with a club. And then, their daughter just takes the guy down in a heartbeat and then can actually spar. And that's actually free sparring. So, but I really like to see people develop their confidence in themselves. In particular, at the time I began the book, that character was based on my now ex-wife, Sonia Mei-Ling Russell. And she is, to a certain extent, matches that person. So I named the main character Mei-Ling, which is my ex-wife's middle name. And my ex-wife is born in Hong Kong, as was the main character, speaks languages, and is a 5th degree black belt in Taekwondo. And by the way, I have wonderful relationships with my ex-wife. There's no hard feelings.
I was guessing so.
Yeah.
I don't know I have plenty of friends who are not close with their exes any longer, and I don't know any of them that would put them in as the main character of a book. The villain, perhaps.
Yeah,
but not paying them homage in that way.
No, I'll give you an interesting story of which there is an anecdote in the book which is similar. So my ex-wife Sonia is about 5'2". She's tough looking, like Mei-Ling. She's strong. She doesn't look weak or petite or anything. But one of the very large males in her office thought that he would play a little trick on her. And he heard that she is a martial artist, and he came up behind her and poked her with his finger, which she does not like to be touched. And so she spun around and put him in a submission hold. And he said, "Whoa!" And she said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "No, we're good. Then she tightened it a little bit, and said, "Are you sure?" Right? He said, "No, I'm sure. He said, "I don't like to be touched." He said, I got it. So, and he was at least a foot taller than her and 100 pounds heavier. So I think it's good for women to stick up for themselves. And there's a scene in the book that very, it's not the exact same situation, but thematically it's the same. It's an aggressive male trying to dominate a smaller woman physically, and then finds out the hard way that wasn't a good choice.
Right on. Is it out? Where do people find it?
Okay, so you can go to Amazon. It's called the Achilles Battle Fleet, or you could go to my website, which is called Brendan Wilson Writes, and it is out in the print version. There is a Kindle version as well, and the audio version should be up by the time this gets published, I suspect.
Cool.
We had a really good experience with audio version. My editor and my producer, Tommy Beardmore and David Himmel, had recruited this young woman, Harmony Zhang, and she was a recent graduate from an MFA program at DePaul University in Chicago, to be the voice actress, and she just nailed it. And I mean, the thing wasn't written by me as a first book with in mind of what the voice actor would have to do. But there's one scene in there. There's a court martial towards the end where there's about a dozen different speakers, and they all have different accents, different ages, different genders, and she just nails it. And I think the reader and the listener is just going to enjoy the thing. But from a producer standpoint and the writer's standpoint, I just stand back in awe. And I was so glad. I told my producer, I said, in a few years, we're not going to be able to afford her. Let's see if we can't get her into a contract for the other.
That's right. Lock her in now.
Yeah, because she's a superstar. Also, very, very nice young person. Very, very personable and easy to work with. The producers loved working with her because there's a lot of military terminology, and when I wrote the book, I didn't realize that not everybody knows how to pronounce Op 4 or something like that. And so we went through, and I didn't bother to point that out. And so we were having to redo a lot of these things to make them so that they would sound right. And she was just really, really great with it. She's also a native Mandarin speaker. There's a lot of Chinese speakers in the book who are speaking in English. And she, of course, knows how to reproduce that sort of accent in a way that I think would be understandable and realistic to people who are Mandarin speakers or Cantonese speakers.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I'm a big fan of audiobooks, and when they're done well, it's not just an audiobook, it's a performance. It's a play, it's a radio play.
Yep.
And it sounds like yours is leaning more in that direction. So I'm pumped for that. When does the audio come out?
It should be out within days. I mean, it's ready to go. We had to do certain things in sequence. You had to do the print version, then the Kindle version. Then the audio version is complete, ready. Just a question of when it gets up onto whatever format the producers are going to put up on it. I think by the time you publish this,
it sounds like that'll be out before we go live here. So that's great. So we can once it's out, let's make sure you get us the direct links to all the different versions, and we'll make sure they're in the show notes.
Absolutely, I absolutely do that.
Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. You mentioned how to find the book. How about how to find you otherwise? Social media, or is there anything else that the listeners should have?
They could go to my martial arts website, which is Aristos, ARISTOS.club. And they could look at it. There's a media tab in there that we made a film in Greece a few years ago, which is included in there. Actually, there's two parts to the film. One is sort of a documentary on the film, where we talked about Aristos. It's done on site in Athens and out on the beach. And then there is a longer series where we've included all of the forms in our art, which includes some Tangsudo forms, ITF, Kuki-1, WTF forms, as well as the forms that are specific to Aristos. One of the things I didn't explain was when students first come into Aristos, we teach them Taekwondo up until the level of first degree black belt. So that's fairly standard. But we have our take on stances and certain techniques. But it's if they want to test with the ITF or the WTF, they can certainly do that after having done that at first degree. And beyond that, it gets to be tailored. They have to develop their own forms. And it's a little bit more specific towards Aristos. So we have lots and lots of all the forms that you'll see on that website. Almost all will be Taekwondo forms of one type or another.
Awesome. Well, you've been amazing today, and I really appreciate having you on. So first off, thank you. And then secondly, I'm going to record an intro and an outro later, but this is kind of the last block where you're going to talk to the audience. So what is it you want to leave them with? Words of wisdom, final thoughts, however you want to term it. Let's go out on a high note.
Let's go out on a high note. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you so much for having me on and giving me a chance to talk that. And again, it was a huge, huge honor to have been offered the chance to do this. I'm very grateful. I would say, as I look back on the martial arts, and any advice that I would give is that it's one of gratefulness, because it's been such a wonderful journey for me and the people that I've met, and I think the good that it has done me. And another one is humility. We've all been in a situation where we come across people who are far better than us, far better than we're going to be, and that's okay. That shouldn't discourage anyone, but it also should put in perspective. You're probably not the toughest guy around or girl. There's somebody out there who can beat you. That's pretty much how I would lead. Is for people that want to do that journey, there's lots of great people out there. Find the martial arts school that's right for you, the art that's right for you. Be flexible and be prepared to have your views change over time, because they probably will if you stay with it.
Wasn't that a good one? Some good stuff going on there, and some of it really different than what we've heard before. Yet, as we already talked about early in the episode, still relatable. It's one of my favorite things about our format. You get enough from everybody to see yourself in them and understand who they are. It's the majority of the time. But you can see, they went there, they did that, they met this person, this cool thing happened, and we get to celebrate our differences, which is one of my favorite things about martial arts training. So, Mr. Wilson, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your time, your sharing. Looking forward to the audiobook and all that good stuff. Now, listeners, make sure you check out the show notes, whistlekickmartialartsradio.com, or for those of you that don't know, and I know I never say this, and I probably should, you can check the show notes in your podcast player. Every podcast player I've ever seen gives you access to the show notes, so that when we link stuff in there, you can see it. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to do that. Check it out. If you head on over to whistlekickmartialartsradio.com, though, that's where you're going to find all the photos and the multimedia stuff that we've got going on. It's where we drop the transcript once that's ready. And it's also the easiest place to sign up for the newsletter, because the newsletter keeps you up on what's going on behind the scenes. We do a lot of stuff, as you know. If you want to support us, thank you. And remember, you've got a bunch of ways you can do it. Everything from the free ways, like telling people and leaving reviews, buying stuff for yourself, or, we've got the Patreon, patreon.com/whistlekick. We've got those training programs. Find them at whistlekickprograms.com. Force, Flex, Fast, and Fuel. I always have trouble remembering the fourth one. Don't forget the code podcast15 to get 15% off everything at whistlekick.com. And if you've got guest suggestions, topic suggestions, or just general feedback, let me know. Jeremy at whistlekick.com. And of course, all the Whistlekick social media is at Whistlekick, no matter where it is. I appreciate you. I thank you for your time. And until next time, train hard, smile, and have a great day.